Welcome back everyone to another video, and today we are going to dive back into some Great War content. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, you're going to be seeing a lot about the Great War, World War I as we know it today, in the coming weeks with my journey to Eastern France, just less than 4 weeks away now. Keeping those fingers crossed, nothing changes with travel plans. We are going to dive back into my favorite channel for historical content related to the Great War, and that is the Great War channel. Our friend Indy Nidell is going to be presenting to us today the story of the Schlieffen Plan and why it failed. So I'm excited to dive into this one, talk a little bit more about what Germany's plan was going into the First World War, how they planned to conduct what on the surface looks like a really bad idea, a two-front war against Russia and France at the same time, and how they thought it would work and why it didn't. So let's dive in.
And over a year ago, the one thing Germany absolutely did not want was what Germany got. A war on two fronts. Indeed, the initial German plan for the war was designed to specifically avoid that, and it was called the Schlieffen Plan. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about the Schlieffen Plan. Now, in our regular episodes last summer, we saw how the German war plans played out in real life as they advanced into Belgium and northern France before being finally stopped at the Battle of the Marne. But for those of you who have only recently joined us, here's a broader overview of what the German plans were before the war. Okay, the Schlieffen Plan, the brainchild of Alfred von Schlieffen, Chief of Staff of the German Imperial Army from 1891 to 1906. The plan itself began to take form in 1905, and the idea was to find a new general war plan that would take into account the many new factors that had arisen since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871.
So when the Franco-Prussian War goes down, which does a number of things, but most significantly it is the main reason why we see a German empire emerge. A united Germany, really for the first time under Otto von Bismarck. It also marks a shift in power to Germany being the power in Europe. And so then everything that happens between the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71 and all the way up to the Great War in 1914 when it begins, is all based on a series of shifting alliances that are all geared toward the idea of balance of power. Everybody's thinking about how do we stack up against Germany? How do we stack up against Austria-Hungary? How do we stack up against France, against Britain, against Russia? And so there's these shifting alliances, and there's these there's a naval Cold War that happens between Britain and Germany, where Germany's kind of escalating the size of their navy so they can compete with Britain, and France and Russia are thinking about how they can balance out this great power of Germany, and so everything that's happening is based on those shifting alliances and that balance of power.
Factors such as Germany's diplomatic isolation, which basically left only Austria-Hungary as a dependable partner and created the problem of a two-front war, since Russia and France were staunch allies. There were also military and technological issues to deal with. You now had machine guns and modern artillery, new forms of communication like the telephone and the radio, and the skyrocketing size of national armies. The Schlieffen Plan was designed to compensate for the belief that German forces would be outnumbered by around 5-3, and thus a war of attrition would not be winnable. It was an offensive plan to avoid that future, and also, against archenemy France, you do not take a defensive posture.
Not only that, but there was this idea called the cult of the offensive. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So the idea of the cult of the offensive, according to this article anyway, so I'll just read it, it's the easiest way to sum it up. Strategic military dilemma where the leaders believe that offensive advantages are so great that a defending force would have no hope of repelling the attack. Consequently, all states choose to attack. It's most often used in the context of explaining the cause of World War I. which is absolutely true, because the belief was that even when on the defensive, you were waiting for an opportunity for a counteroffensive. That being on the attack was such a great advantage that you had to take advantage of that. And like it said, one of the reasons it really leads to World War I is that because everybody believed that offensive was so much better than defensive, that they all kind of started escalating their mobilization to the point where they had to go to war because they couldn't risk being left behind because the other guy was going to get the jump on you. And so I have to mobilize even though we're really not at war yet, because I can't risk you mobilizing before I do, because then you'll get the offensive on me. And so the cult of the offensive, the idea that offense was always better than defense, is absolutely one of the main reasons why they hurtled toward war. And the Schlieffen Plan is part of that. It's jump on one of them first, and then we can counterstrike on the other side.
So, the original plan was that 7/8 of the troops deployed to the west were going to circumvent the strong French defenses on the Franco-German border by marching through Belgium and the Netherlands. This was, already in 1905, an acknowledgement that violating Belgian neutrality might well bring Britain into the war.
And honestly, as I'm sure he's going to talk about why it failed, this ends up being why it failed. Honestly, I think Germany takes Paris in the first 6 weeks, which is what their plan was, had it not been for the stubborn resistance of the Belgians. If the King of Belgium had just allowed the Germans to pass through unmolested, which they tried to get them to do, not only would you potentially not have Britain entering the war right away, but you don't have the stubborn resistance of Germany having to get through Belgium. It takes them a month to get through Belgium, and so by the time they get into France and they get really pretty close to Paris until they're stopped at the Battle of the Marne, I think they would have got there. So Belgium really saved the war for the Allies.
Anyhow, the remaining troops would be at the Franco-German border and would draw the French into battles with them, and then would get outflanked from the north, encircle Paris, and drive the remaining French forces to the south. After this swift success, they could then send most of the troops over to fight against Russia.
And part of what they were counting on, the Germans was a relatively new idea in warfare, which was to move your troops rapidly by rail. Now, I shouldn't say it was new, because you go back to the American Civil War, and the first Battle of Bull Run was won by the Confederacy in part because they were able to move an army swiftly by rail from the Harper's Ferry area down to Manassas Junction. But this was a whole different level, because we're talking moving hundreds of thousands of men by rail rapidly to the east at the conclusion of this Western Front to go counterstrike in the east.
There was no plan in place for dealing with Russia, though, just the French part. Schlieffen was no longer chief of staff when the war broke out. He had been succeeded by Helmut von Moltke, the young...
Schlieffen actually dies in 1913, like a year and a half before the war. He was pretty old. I mean, he was... of course, von Moltke was pretty old too. If you look at it, he's almost 70 years old when the war breaks out. But Schlieffen died, I think got kicked by a horse or something toward the end of his career. But interesting thing about Schlieffen, if you look into his story a little bit, he's a fascinating character. He based a lot of his tactics on Hannibal back in like the 3rd century BC and his successes against Rome. And then you look at a lot of the World War II generals, people like Eisenhower, Walter Beetle Smith, others. They actually spoke very highly of Schlieffen and some of his innovations and some of his tactics. A lot of even, I think, the ideas for the German Blitzkrieg were based on ideas that Schlieffen proposed.
And Moltke made a few changes to the plan. For starters, he changed the plan so it only invaded Belgium and not the Netherlands. He wanted to leave the Netherlands as a supply corridor, since Germany itself might be blockaded. Also, the defense of East Prussia was of greater importance to Moltke than Schlieffen, and had to be provided for. Good thing that he had a lot more men at his disposal than Schlieffen had. As we know now, the Schlieffen Plan failed, and Germany was forced to fight a two-front war that was often a war of attrition. And there were a number of reasons for this failure.
Indy.
Yes?
Indy.
Yes?
Indy.
Yes?
Sorry. Hi, Indy. It's Cody from Alternate History Hub.
Ah,
Oh,
nice.
okay, cool. Hey, I watched your video about Britain siding with the Central Powers last year. That was great.
Glad you liked it. I watched your show too, and because of that, wanted to go back to some World War I scenarios. Since you're talking about the Schlieffen Plan, I wanted to mention that I just published a video asking the question, what if the Schlieffen Plan had actually worked?
Might have to do that one.
That sounds excellent. Okay, so everybody watching me, you should check out Cody's video for sure and see how elemental the Schlieffen Plan was to the outcome of World War I.
Alright, really like your fire extinguisher with the clock you have there. But I'll be on my way then.
Well, yeah, it's an antique, but thanks for coming by. All right, so why did the Schlieffen Plan actually fail? Just looking at the numbers objectively, it seems doubtful there were ever enough German troops to achieve the encirclement of Paris and to drive the remaining French troops southward. Not so.
True to a point. There did need to be a few more German troops, and part of the problem was that right when they were just on the verge of maybe getting to Paris, they had to shift troops to the east because one of the things the Schlieffen Plan failed to take into account was how quickly the Russians mobilized. They thought Russia being huge, having a lot of manpower, would take them much longer to mobilize than it really did. And so in a panic, they had to pull troops off the Western Front to shift them to the east to hold back the Russians. Had they not had to do that, I think even with the slowdown in Belgium, there's a chance they might have been able to break through to Paris.
So much that there weren't enough men initially, but the fact that casualties couldn't really properly be replaced. See, the German army was as well equipped in general as anyone else, but that was the regular troops. This was not so for the reserve and replacement troops, who were not even trained with new equipment, were not as well trained anyhow, did not have machine gun crews or artillery regiments, and could not really implement the plan. The plan relied on speed for success, and speed relied on transportation. So how would that work? Well, at the beginning of the war, Germany had 5,000 cars and 1.4 million horses. But to really move the troops, you'd need trains, right? So you can only go where the train tracks go. And once the Germans invaded Belgium and France, the Belgians and French destroyed the track as they retreated. So
you can only get them to the German border, but then you got to use other means of transportation. So the further you get away from your rail base, the slower things are going to go. So I hadn't thought about the whole training aspect with new recruits, but that definitely makes sense too.
Had to be laid again. One reason Liège was so important to take was that it was a major railway hub, so you couldn't go anywhere until you took it. And the railway issues produced big supply issues too.
And Liège ends up being the big problem. That's where the Germans get massively slowed down, is trying to take the fortress of Liège. The Belgians put up way more resistance than was expected, and then there's what's sometimes referred to as the rape of Belgium. It's these atrocities that take place where the Germans are frustrated, they're angry at how slow things are going through Belgium, they're blaming Belgian civilians for sabotage and for things behind the lines and stuff like that, and they start turning on the Belgian civilians, and a lot of them get killed. And this is one of the early things that happens in the war that really paints Germany as the bad guys in the war. They kind of brought that on themselves.
See, much as railways are inflexible, the whole Schlieffen Plan was inflexible. Once it was set in motion, there was no turning back and no alternative plan. Here's a little anecdote from the first days of the war. The Kaiser got a misleading telegraph from London that claimed the French weren't mobilizing at all. So he ordered Mulkey to deploy all his troops against Russia. Mulkey replied, "The deployment of millions of men cannot be improvised. It is the result of years of planning. Once set, it cannot be changed. If His Majesty insists on sending all available troops to the east, they would not get a battle-ready army, but a bunch of armed men without any food." And the movement was so tight that any mistakes or delays would cause the plan to crumble.
So you can see why that's a problem, because as it's been often said, no plan survives contact with the enemy. As soon as you contact the enemy, you have to adjust for what he does, because if he doesn't do what you expect him to do, that means you might have to adjust. And that rigid inflexibility that says this is the plan and this is the way it has to go no matter what does not allow for what happens if things don't go the way you expect them to. What happens if the enemy doesn't do what you expect him to, because that is going to happen. And so, as we talked about in the Zulu series the last several days, it's great to have a plan, but the great generals are the ones who are able to think on their feet and adjust when their plan doesn't work.
And the train schedule didn't even account for delayed trains or broken tracks. And the siege of Liège took nearly 2 weeks instead of the 2 days that the Germans had expected, which tied up a lot of troops and prevented the Germans from using most of the Belgian railways until Liège fell, delaying the plan. Good communication was also important if you want to get things moving quickly. Germany was on the same technical level as the other nations when it came to communications. The problem was that telegraphs and radios became scarce the closer you would get to the front, and right at the front, pigeons and flags were still used.
And that's true all the way up to the end of the war. Even when you're using airplanes and tanks by the end of World War I, carrier pigeons are a huge part of things. The Lost Battalion, the Americans, their carrier pigeon, Cher Ami, which is in the Smithsonian Institution today, was huge in getting them out of the friendly fire that they were suffering from.
This meant that the High Command would get an outdated picture of events and was giving orders based on outdated situations. But one of the biggest mistakes of the whole thing was misinterpreting how things would be in the East. The original Schlieffen Plan dismissed Russia as a strong enemy because Russia had just lost to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. And the version of the plan in 1914 basically ignored how much Russia had modernized in the past decade. Russia also mobilized before France, adding additional time pressure on Moltke in the West and forcing him to send troops from the Western Front to the Eastern Front before he wanted to.
And at that point, the chance to take Paris is pretty much lost, and they don't really threaten Paris again. I mean, there's this time in the Spring Offensive in 1918 where there was some fear that they could, but honestly, that was their best chance. As soon as they shipped those troops east, it was gone.
But guess what? Some of them refused to go. The Bavarian forces at the Franco-German border were the logical choice to send to the east to defend Prussia. They were on or near German soil and were the easiest to divert. But the Bavarians refused to go and defend Prussia. Moltke was forced to take troops from Belgium, much more difficult and much more time-consuming. He had problems with making his generals obey his exact orders in general. Those Bavarian troops, for example, were under the command of Prince Ruprecht, the last Bavarian crown prince, and he had his own interests. See, the German army was organized federally during peacetime, and only during war was it all united under one command. So Ruprecht refused to take his Bavarian troops to defend Prussia, and even when...
So, yeah, it's important to remember that at this point, though the German Empire exists as a political entity, there are still kingdoms and municipalities within the German Empire that have their own, Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, etc., that have their own leadership and their own federal kind of structure. And so, yeah, I mean, until they were actually in war, they had different commanders. And so there's still kind of that sectarian, sectional kind of thing going on there. That's another thing I honestly hadn't really thought about was, moving those Bavarian troops from this part right here where they could quickly hop on trains and get east versus having to take troops from Belgium who are on the tip of the spear, so to speak, that have to march back and pull off the front lines. And now you've got to replace those troops. And oh, what a nightmare.
He was given the task of just keeping the French troops at the border occupied. He didn't like that either. So he went on the offensive, clearly violating the plan. A German officer was caught by the French and told them details of the plan, and the French could retreat much more efficiently. Delays, sieges, poor communications, and the transportation mess that really should have been anticipated served only to throw the plan off kilter, even before the Battle of the Marne. But really, the lack of alternatives and the total inflexibility of the Schlieffen Plan in many ways doomed it from the start and led to what Germany most wanted to avoid, a two-front war and a bloody war of attrition. They really should have anticipated things better if they ever wanted the plan to work. And you're probably wondering what would actually have happened had the plan worked. So, click right here to go over to Cody's channel, Alternate History, and find out. And if you came over...
All right, so we'll check that out tomorrow. We'll look at Cody's video on Alternate History Hub about what would have happened if the Schlieffen Plan had worked, which I think, obviously, I think the obvious answer is that Germany wins World War I, but I guess we'll take a look at that. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. If there's anything particular about the Great War you'd like me to cover in the coming weeks, I want to talk about it. We're not going to do nothing but World War I in the next 3 or 4 weeks, but we are going to talk a lot about it just because I want to give a lot of background before you start seeing my historic site videos. And I also am going to have a video coming in the next week or so where I'm going to be kind of laying out the details of where I'm going, what I'm going to be seeing, so you guys know what to expect, and also let you know how you can see some of that content while I'm still there, even before it comes out on the channel. So that'll be coming here very, very soon. Thanks for watching.